Hello, this is Craig Wesco recording for TCGplayer.com, and today we're going to be playing a little brew in Modern. We're going to be playing a mono white devotion deck that a friend of mine, Justin Heilig, and I have been working on. Kind of came up with the idea based on a deck he built for Standard back when it was a thing in Standard, and we wanted to see how it'll do in Modern. So there's a few interesting synergies that are worth talking about before we get started. One is, well, why are we playing 8 border posts? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it basically counts as a land that increases our devotion by 1. So that's one of the reasons. And then another reason is Night of the White Orchid. So if we play turn 1, plains, pick it up, play border post, turn 2, replay the plains, we can cast a Knight and get a plains onto the battlefield, assuming we're on the draw or we do it the following turn. But basically it's a way to get a land off of the Knight. And another related way is Weathered Wayfarer. So if we play the same line where we go turn 1, or we can actually play turn 1 Wayfarer, especially works if we're on the draw. But even on the play, we play Wayfarer. Turn 2, we play a border post and then replay the plains, and then on the following turn, if we're on the play, we have to wait till the opponent's turn. We can activate Wayfarer when they play their second land, and we just have a plains and a border post. So then we can activate the Wayfarer to either find another plains or to find a Field of Ruin or Ghost Quarter if they're on like Valakut or Tron or something like that. Or more than likely we're going to find a Nykthos. So the Wayfarer kind of has a couple of important roles, and the primary role is not just to get lands, but to find Nykthos. And the Nykthos can produce us a bunch of mana to cast our big spells. And one other interesting devotion card in this deck is Leyline of Sanctity. So you have an opening game action at the beginning of the game to start the game with all the ley lines that you draw in your opener on the battlefield. So this means once we get to Nykthos, this adds 2 additional devotion, and we didn't have to invest any resources in putting it onto the battlefield. And it also has a neat side effect, a few actually. The primary one is that we're immune to discard spells. So discard spells are one of the ways to take our payoff card. So if they Thoughtseize us, they can take, our big spell, whether it's a Planeswalker, an Elesh Norn, an X spell, something like that. Or they can take our early cards that set up our devotion. So if we keep a hand that relies on the Wayfarer or a Knight or a border post to get going, well, they can't take it out of our hand and make our hand kind of not function. And then, of course, against a card like Valakut the Molten Pinnacle or Grapeshot, well, they just can't kill us if we have the ley line, depending on their build. But a lot of the builds are just cold to it. So we're going to get a lot of free wins, we get a lot of added protection, and then we also get added devotion. And since devotion is what our deck is trying to do, it fits into our main deck strategy a lot better than it does most other strategies in the format that played in the sideboard. So then another cool thing that Leyline does is it'll protect our face, but it also keeps us gets our devotion up so we can cast our Planeswalkers and our Elesh Norn. So then we have most of the other cards are just kind of like the big value payoffs and then ways to not die to what the opponent's doing. So we have Path to Exile as just the cheapest, best, most efficient removal spell in the format. And it also has the added benefit of making sure our Knight and our Wayfarer get turned on. So we kind of mitigate the drawback of Path. So even if we're on the play, we can get ahead, or we can put the opponent ahead on lands because of Path, if we path their early threat, and then we can get our Wayfarer and our Knight active and catch right back up. So Path is just super efficient in this deck. And then we have Oblivion Ring, just as another kind of catch-all, and it adds to our devotion while dealing with basically any problematic permanent. Nevermore, this is a good one. It adds double devotion, 2 white mana, and also it can stop key cards. So if you're playing against like a Living End deck, well, you're not casting Living End. If you're playing against the Eldrazi deck, well, you're not casting Allah's Dust. If you're playing against a Storm deck, well, you got to find another way to kill me other than Grape Shot. So there's a lot of interesting cards you can name. Primeval Titan, Scape Shift, depending on what the board looks like. If we have a Leyline in play, then just name Primeval Titan, and they just can't kill us. So there's a lot of things that Nevermore does that are pretty cool. And then we have some Planeswalkers. So we have Gideon and Elspeth. Those are, I think, two of the best, most effective white Planeswalkers in Modern right now. And given that we can produce a reasonable amount of mana pretty quickly off of Nykthos in this deck, we can get Elspeth down as early as turn 3, usually around turn 4. And when you have Elspeth that early, sometimes you can minus to clear out all the, kill your Reality Smasher and your Thought-Knot Seer, or against, some other strategies like kill your Death Shadow and your Gurmag Angler and your Tassiger. Just kind of, it's just pretty good at the minus ability. And then the plus ability of making soldiers each turn is just like, we can win the game pretty quickly, especially when we follow up the next turn with Elish Norn. So you make some soldiers, and then next turn you make some more soldiers, and they're 3/3s. And the opponent's creatures, now, however big they are, they're going to be dwarfed in size by the -2/-2. So those are kind of some of the big payoffs. And then what I found in the initial version of testing this deck is that we don't want too many like 5 mana, 6 mana, 7 mana type spells because they tend to clog your hand. Instead, what worked better was these X spells that can scale based on where we're at in the game and how much mana we have available. So a lot of times we'll get into a board position where we have all our setup cards. We cast our Knight, we have some border posts out, we cast Nevermore, we have a Leyline, and now we have all access to all this mana, but we have nothing to use the mana on. We have no payoff card in hand. So we're just drawing off the top of our library. So we want to maximize the amount of hits that we can draw when we're in that position. So we want, if we draw like a Gideon, an Elspeth, or an Elish Norn, great. But if we draw any of these cards, well, that doesn't really, we still need to draw a payoff card because we're not going to win the game by attacking with the Knight of the White Orchid and Weathered Wayfarer for 20. We need to have one of these cards to win the game. So Secure the Waste and Walking Ballista are the two cards that can help early to where we don't just die. And then also late in the game, they could be cards that win us the game. So Secure the Waste for like 9 tokens can win us the game in like 2 turns. And similarly, a Ballista for, something like 5 or 6 counters can win the game in a couple turns as well. And then also like early on like turn 4 or something, or when we have access to just like 4 mana and we need time to develop, we can kill a couple of their creatures, get a good chump block in, or we could chump block multiple creatures, make some trades, stuff like that. And then with Gideon Emblem, that's also a thing. Like the secure tokens, you can make them bigger with Elish Norn or Gideon Emblem, and that comes up sometimes. So those are the X spells that I chose as the most effective ones. And now in the sideboard, we have some answers to things that are otherwise problematic. And then we also have some more versatile sideboard cards because we have some main deck cards that, well, if Leyline doesn't do anything against our opponent, like we need to take that out. And Path to Exile, if they don't have creatures, that needs to go out. And sometimes some of the other, like Elish Norn, if they don't have creatures, isn't very good, and it's not worth having a 7-drop in your hand that just anthems your team. And so we have a lot of kind of versatile sideboard cards. We have Tectonic Edge, which is good against any of the special land decks like Tron and Valakut, but then it's also just good in the value mid-range matchups. Grafdigger's Cage is good against most of the graveyard decks outside of Living End. Don't bring it in that matchup, it doesn't work. But it's also good against the Collected Company Court of Calling decks. So it kind of works against multiples of the top decks in the format. Rest in Peace is a little different than Grafdigger's Cage. It doesn't help against Company and Cord, but it does extra work against cards like Delve out of the Death Shadow deck, or cards like decks that use the graveyard for other things, not just for bringing stuff back. So like against Dredge, this is especially effective because it keeps them from dredging, and also you can the Delve counterspell that is in the blue-white deck, it stops that as well, and then it also stops Living End. Devout Lightcaster, this one's an interesting one. So it's a little narrow, but it's especially good in this deck. So I wanted to play a couple of them in the sideboard. So it's triple white devotion for 3 mana, which means the next turn we're going to have access to a ton of mana because of the Lightcaster. So any matchup where it's reasonable, you kind of want to bring this in. It's especially good against Death Shadow because it kills any of their big creatures and then blocks the next one. And you can also kill Liliana with it, which is really cool. And then sometimes I'll basically bring it in any matchup where they have anything it can kill. So even if their only thing that it kills is like a Tidehollow Sculler or a Vault Scourge or something like that, a lot of times it's still good enough to bring in because the devotion it produces is so good. We don't have any ways to bounce and flicker it or anything like that, but the devotion is the secondary attribute of this card that's really good in this deck. Nevermore, we just bring in 2 more Nevermores because it's, again, a really good devotion enabler. And in the combo matchups where we don't want to, where like Path to Exile and things like that aren't especially good, this one usually shines exceptionally well. Another card is Wrath of God. So we have 4 of those, and I'm thinking it might be correct to replace 2 of these with Day of Judgment, just because the Humans deck is becoming a thing, and they have Meddling Mage, and so if they Meddling Mage, the card they're going to name post-sideboard is Wrath of God against us. And when they do that, I think we'd rather have 2 Day of Judgment, 2 Wrath of God, so that we can still cast the other one. I don't know that there's any regenerators that can punish us for this, but I know that Meddling Mage is a card that's increasing in popularity because of that deck. So might want to switch that up to 2 and 2. Then the last card is Quarantine Field. So it's kind of like an Oblivion Ring, but it gives us an extra devotion, and it scales. So we have 1 main deck and 1 sideboard. So that if we're in a position where we just have access to a bunch of mana in the mid-game, we can Quarantine Field and basically exile their entire board. You can hit like 2, 3, even 4 permanents sometimes with a Quarantine Field. So it can get really, really out of hand. Or you could just pay 4 mana to basically exile one thing, and then we also get the extra 1 devotion out of it because it's double white instead of single. So yeah, this deck, it's probably not something that you've seen before, or at least haven't. I don't know that anyone's made a video of it, at least not recently. But it's I think that it's good enough to compete. I don't know if I have all the numbers right, and I'd be open to suggestions if you have any ideas on some really cool cards that might fit into this deck. But these are certainly going to be some interesting games. Let's try to make them instructional and learn some things as well.